Hey, Richard Chapo here, Internet attorney, San Diego, California. I've been representing online businesses for about the past 20 years, and I still do. So today I wanted to talk about an interesting aspect of really the Splinternet more than the EU copyright directive, but to show you kind of how the Splinternet can come about with less than devious intent. Let's talk about the Splinternet. What is it? It's the dividing of the internet due to political, economic, technological, nationalistic, or religious reasons. Now, honestly, there could be other reasons as well. It doesn't really matter what the reason is, so much as it is the dividing of the internet in one way or another that restricts a certain amount of information that one group is receiving versus another. If we look at China, obviously, I think everybody knows they restrict some of the data that comes into the country for political reasons. You know, they don't want data out there that's going to cause what they would view as political and civil strife. And so, you know, they block some of the stuff that might, criticize the Chinese government. Now, when we think of the Splinternet, we usually think of intentional acts like that from authoritarian figures or from some devious, individuals such as, Darth Vader working the puppet strings of society. And it makes for good headlines. But really, what we're seeing mostly with the Splinternet is not this, devious plan thought up by Vladimir Putin or, something of that sort. Instead, we're seeing a lot of indirect impact, indirect development of the Splinternet from other acts and efforts that really aren't created with the Splinternet in mind or even any of those concepts. They just come about unintentionally. And so when people, hear the Splinternet and they roll their eyes, well, the important thing to understand is not only is it a real concept, but it's here. Now it is already starting to impact you. And, you may not understand that, but it's going to start becoming more and more evident as we move forward here. So what is it about the EU copyright directive that raises this issue? Well, people have talked about the EU copyright directive pro and against, and I certainly have. And it's not so much that I want to get into the specifics of the merits of the directive. It's just, what indirect impact can it have? And so if we're looking at the link tax in Article 11, certainly we have news sources here. And, the EU wants news aggregators, of which, of course, Google is the largest, to pay a licensing fee if they're going to link to news sources in the EU. And that sounds all great and everything, but what the likely outcome of this is Google is going to filter out those news sources. So if there is a story on the German chancellor, that is, I don't know, it's a scandal or something of that sort. Google isn't probably not going to link to the sources in Germany, the news resources. Instead, they'll link to, maybe paper in the UK or paper in Canada, maybe the New York Times or the LA Times, something of that sort, where they don't have to pay. And so what will happen is by filtering out news sources in the EU, and maybe it'll only be a couple of countries, maybe it's the entire EU. It just kind of depends what the individual member states do as far as the licensing fee. But the end result is that you're limiting the exposure of some news. So we're not talking cat videos here. We're talking about the actual flow of important information, or at least potentially important information. And so you can see it kind of on that level. With Article 13, we get into what we're calling the copyright filter, the infringement filter. So what Article 13 says, when you really boil it down, is that companies who are moving large amounts of data have to filter that data to make sure there's no infringing content in it. Now, proponents of Article 13 will tell you, no, they took the filter provision out. But if you actually read the entire article, there's no way to comply without filtering. And if these large platforms fail to filter, then they can be fined, significant amounts of money. So what do you think those large platforms are going to do? They're going to have very restrictive filters, certainly at least in the EU. And so the thing that is worrisome about that is copyright is a fungible concept. You think you know what it means, but do you really? Because I can tell you the courts usually don't. And the issue, of course, is fair use. And so if we have a recognized defense to copyright, such as criticism, let us say, how do you develop an algorithm that can make a determination as to whether it's copyright infringement or it is, unallowed criticism? Or how about a parody? And the answer is, I don't know how you do that. And I've yet to see anybody doing it correctly, including YouTube. And this isn't really a surprise because, frankly, the courts haven't figured it out. I'll give you an example. We have a situation in the US with a YouTube video. I want to say this was around 2008. A woman shot a video of her baby dancing. It's a short video, but for about 20 seconds, the baby is dancing to a Prince song. And so the music publisher sued for copyright infringement. And this case went on for 10 years. Was it fair use? Was it not fair use? Could attorney's fees be awarded? On and on and on and on and on. And this isn't from 2008 to 2018. So if the judges at each level couldn't decide or couldn't agree, on one particular outcome, how are you possibly going to design a filter that's going to address those? So is that meme of, Theresa May doing something funny? Well, is that going to be considered a parody, or is that just straight copyright infringement from the person who took the original photo? I have no idea how they're going to try to address that. And so what you're going to see is the reduction of the flow of news in the EU online, certainly across those platforms. And a lot of people get their news from those platforms these days. And so we're seeing a limitation on free speech. And that's really what it is. Now, did the EU and the proponents of the copyright directives, set out with a nefarious intent to limit the flow of news and free speech? No, not at all. Even the people who absolutely despise the copyright directive would never assert as much. It's just a side effect of it. But that's what we're seeing as the primary building block of the Splinternet. It is not this intentional act of devious, evil characters. Instead, it is just as laws stack up and stack up and stack up, and European Union and government, in particular governments, in particular trade areas such as NAFTA, we see these walls going up. And we're reaching the point where, frankly, you're going to start noticing them. And so you need to take the Splinternet seriously. I mean, one only has to look at the GDPR to see it in effect. Of course, that's, I'm sure you probably know this already, but on May 25th, 2018, when the GDPR went into effect, if you were in Europe, your access to a lot of major newspapers in the United States was blocked. The Los Angeles Times in the United States it's a major newspaper. I don't know, second or third biggest in the U.S. probably, and obviously has a lot of coverage on key U.S. political events, particularly in California, which is the sixth or seventh biggest economy in the world. And if you were in Europe and you tried to pull up the LA Times, you couldn't view it. That should be troubling. Now, maybe you don't give a hoot about the LA Times, and that's fine. But if that's happening in that scenario, well, it's going to be happening in other scenarios as well. And so, the concept of the internet as this worldwide medium with the free flow of information, well, is that really still the case? And what's the future going to look like? So the Splinternet is something that we need to be paying attention to. And if you have a business or something that you're planning online, you also need to take that into account. What impact can it have on your business projections moving forward and your mission statement? Do you need to start thinking about forming different businesses in different areas? Maybe one business in Ireland for the EU, one business entity completely on its own versus another one completely in the U.S. that's restricted to the U.S. Because ultimately, I think that's where we may very well end up. And I think you've seen some of the larger companies start already thinking about this. Google being a company way ahead of its time in this area. They can say whatever they want about forming forming Alphabet, the parent company now. But it smells a lot like a company planning for a fractured, splintered internet. And so it will be interesting to see if other companies start doing that as well. So anyways, it's not something you necessarily need to worry about at this moment, but if you want to win on the internet, it's important to plan for not what's happening today, but what's happening in the future. And you can see the Splinternet is going to become one of the major issues that we confront here in the not too distant future. So hopefully, if nothing else, this will get you thinking about it. So that's it for the Splinternet and the EU copyright directive. Again, not necessarily to pick on the EU. Many other countries or regions are issuing rules and regulations and laws that are having similar effects. But this is certainly one that's in the news, and we can see kind of the practical effect, pretty clearly. So anyways, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Have yourself a good one.